success of X-Men, Marvel began to sell all of their comic book properties. The Hulk was sold to Universal, the Fantastic Four went to 20th Century Fox, and the plans for a Spider-Man movie got rolling at Columbia Pictures. And in 2002, the film was released to record-breaking box office numbers and critical acclaim. This movie helped shape the film industry for the next decade. I personally have a really close relationship with this film. It was released when I was 6 years old. It's one of the earliest movies I can remember seeing in theaters. Images from Spider-Man fighting the Green Goblin to having his final swing in New York have stayed inside my head for years. This movie has a giant impact on my childhood. It was one of the first DVDs we ever owned, and I watched it hundreds of times. The special features gave me the first experience into filmmaking, something that would later become my life's passion. And it was the first time I came to know Spider-Man, one of my all-time favorite superheroes. So with this movie being so important to me, what do I think of it today? Well, it's still awesome. I think a lot of the movie has aged well. The action sequences, the effects, and most importantly, the story. This is the first Marvel film that has given a story that really stuck with me. It's a perfect example of how to do a superhero story well. It's enjoyable, it has happy moments and sad moments, and you really feel the abilities that Spider-Man has. It's just an all-around great flick. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get to the bad stuff. Well, the dialogue. This is the main weakness of the film. When the characters are straight out talking to each other, this dialogue is so cheesy. No other word to describe how cringing some of the words can get. The conversations between Mary Jane and Peter, awful. This conversation between Peter and Aunt May, horrendous. The rough conversation between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin? What the heck is going on here? Even as a kid, I thought this was just some of the most obnoxious conversations that have ever been spoken. They do not talk like real people. I mean, yes, it's a comic book adaptation, where most of the dialogue is exposition and the conversations always have to have obvious meaning. But then you get great dialogue scenes between Uncle Ben and Peter, and that scene after the graduation where Aunt May goes and talks to Peter in his room. I mean, come on, choose movie. Either cheesy dialogue to go with the comic book feel, or realistic dialogue to help create a more familiar setting. It's not the worst thing in this movie though, because we have the Green Goblin. Okay, how do I put this? He's not threatening. I mean, there are many different stereotypes for villains, and once in a while, you get someone who will mix these stereotypes to create an excellent character, like Heath Ledger's Joker, who mixed a sadistic mind with confusing agendas, and was sometimes funny. This is a threatening mix. Now here's the Green Goblin. He looks silly, says silly things, and just screams once in a while, mixed with a lot of grunting. In fact, there is a ton of grunting in this movie, just listen. So the Green Goblin is basically a clown. A very green clown. Willem Dafoe does a great job as Norman Osborn, but when he gets under the mask, it's like watching a different person. I mean, that's kind of his character's point, but what I mean is, it's like your 5-year-old cousin under a mask as he tries to be scary. It just turns out cute. And sadly, even Norman Osborn doesn't add much to the film. They try to explain how his and Harry's relationship is confusing and complicated, but it never had much of an effect on me. I don't think it was dived into enough. I think they were just focusing on having a good reason for Harry to hate Spider-Man in the sequel. Kind of dull, but at least James Franco does a good portrayal of Harry Osborn. In fact, all the actors do great. Uncle Ben and Aunt May, played by Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris, portray the duo perfectly. When I think Uncle Ben and Aunt May, I think of those two. And Kirsten Dunst does a fine job, as well as Tobey Maguire. It's just that, well, the dialogue had to be hard to work with. But hey, at least they got a good director like Sam Raimi, who really gives a good style to this film that is present throughout the entire series. Even the inclusion of Bruce Campbell, who has a very awesome cameo. And that ending. I mean, this final fight is probably one of my all-time favorite film scenes. Seriously, the atmosphere, the intensity, the music buildup all equals into what I call a perfect fight scene. Another thing, instead of having tons of pop tracks here and there, this movie has a great score by Danny Elfman. He also did the original Batman score, and these tracks are just as memorable. I love it to death. It's a good thing that modern music wasn't used, because it would really date the film. Speaking of that, how has the movie aged? Well, for the most part, it's aged pretty well. In some respects. I mean, you have scenes that make it feel very late 90s, early 2000s-ish. The effects are alright, but you can really tell that it's a computer that's making him swing around. And the cinematography has always made this film feel very of the time. Maybe it's just my DVD and the coloring, but I don't know. It's kind of like when you watch stop motion effects from the 80s. You definitely know it comes from the 80s. And don't let me forget to mention the best part of the movie, J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. He owns this role. Even though it's a smaller part, he doesn't take that into account. He goes out there and becomes the yelling businessman. You truly believe this person is real. He has the best dialogue, the best expressions, the best voice. He's all around the most memorable part of the movie. You all probably know from my Spider-Man film comparison video that I like the reboot a lot more. But that doesn't mean I hate this film. This film just has a lot more cheesy and dated moments that the reboot thankfully fixed. But this movie still has a lot to love. It's a great way to help kickstart a decade of great superhero films, as well as a great franchise that gets even better with its sequel. But you'll just have to wait and see what I have to say about that.